I'm so grateful that both of you can be here, and I wonder if, as a starting point, yeah, you would be willing to introduce yourselves to the people who are part of this whole process and viewing this conversation.
Sure. Hi, friends. I'm Kristen Leslie. I'm on the faculty at Eden. I'm the professor of pastoral theology and care. Been here about 13 years, and I teach all sorts of things about pastoral care and things in the community, and some courses like pastoral care in the public arena. I'm United Methodist clergy, and I'm thrilled to be here.
And I'm thrilled to be here too. My name is Marian Edmonds-Allen. I'm the executive director of Parity, which is based in New York. And what we do is we work to heal LGBT and faith divides. I'm a very happy, well-prepared graduate of Eden Theological Seminary, MDiv 2011, and DMin 2023. And Steve, I'm just delighted to be here.
Thank you. Well, ahead of this conversation, you all have had some time to meet and consider what we're up to. And I wonder, Marian, if you would just start us off.
I'd be glad to, yes. And when I said well-prepared graduate, what I meant was that Eden Theological Seminary provided me with a wonderful education. And my classes with Kristen especially have been invaluable to me, and in fact, set my direction in the world. And a big part of that direction has been working with boundaries. I found myself in Utah working with homeless youth, LGBT youth. And what I found doing that work was that there were people, to be frank, people of a different faith background who I viewed as being the cause of LGBT youth homelessness. And this was distressing to me on many, many levels. And I found that I was having trouble relating to them. I saw this boundary as being a wall that was being built brick by brick by brick. And I started more banging against that wall and trying to raise awareness of the plight of homeless youth who were sleeping in tents, who were sleeping in railroad cars and in snowbanks. And I wasn't getting anywhere. But then one day I met a person who I viewed as my enemy. So this was a person who was on the other side of that brick wall, I thought. And I didn't like her, and I was sure she didn't like me. And I saw her as part of the problem, and I wanted to get away from her as quickly as I could. And I did, but then she tracked me down and came to my youth center. Long story short, and this is in a handout actually that you can access, there's the story. Long story short, Laura became my friend. She turned from my enemy to my colleague and partner in addressing youth homelessness. While she didn't understand what it was like to be LGBT, like me, who's LGBT, and she didn't share my faith, she did care about these young people. I thought that since she was a Latter-day Saint who I blamed for youth homelessness, that Laura hated queer youth. But actually, Laura loved all youth, queer or not. So because of Laura, we were able to solve the youth homelessness problem in Utah. She brought things to the table that I didn't have. She was able to say, Marian, let's change the laws. She was a legislative aide at the time. So because of Laura, what I was trying to do was accomplished, not because I was so great. I wasn't. I was part of the problem. But Laura was part of the solution. And together, then we could solve this problem. And it was because of this wall, this brick wall that came tumbling down. You know, there's all kinds of imagery that come to mind around that, walls tumbling down, that things started to happen in the world that were beautiful and good. The wall that I had erected was a hindrance to the work of God in the world. So since then, this is my world. I work to not transgress boundaries so much as work around them and over them and through them. And to, when I see a wall now, whether it's something that I've created or someone else has created, that's where I'm drawn to. Let's see what happens when this wall comes down.
So I grew up the child of a college chaplain in the 1960s and 70s, which meant I probably couldn't have shared with you a whole lot of Bible verses or where the church necessarily came down on things, but I could tell you who was protesting what. I could tell you being out there on the streets as a kid of a college chaplain in the 60s and 70s during Vietnam, particularly. So I grew up having this, that what church meant for me was to go out and speak, go out and stomp and yell. Um, uh, and those are really good skills sometimes if in appropriate places, but in the beginning of the 2000s, I was working at another institution and I got asked to come to be to come do a workshop, to come work at the Air Force, the United States Air Force Academy, because they had just kind of landed themselves in the middle of a sexual assault crisis. And a lot of my research has been around sexualized violence and the role of the religious professionals working in that space. And so they asked me to come out and do some work with them. And I realized going out there that the skills that I had for standing on the outside and banging and yelling were not the same skills that I needed once I got inside working with the military. And so I reached out to some colleagues to kind of get a sense for what's this whole new set of skills that I'm going to need to work with folks who I really knew very little about in the military context, and I really had demonized. And so that's kind of started in the trajectory of the work that I did, was learning appreciation of folks who were very different. And in many ways, like Marian, that we had very similar commitments. And yet I had kind of for so long built up this barrier that said they are the bad ones and I'm on the good side. I'm on the side of the saints. And I kind of had to reframe all sorts of things that I did and develop some new skills, because when I went into the Air Force Academy and then subsequently both the Navy and working with the Navy and the Marines, I had to learn a whole new set of skills in order to kind of find that space to reach across the boundary. And that was quite a learning journey for me.
Both of those are so rich and wonderful. This is really a program to support people who are also finding themselves working in spaces and places where they may not share or understand how they share similar commitments. They may see the walls, they may be about the walls, building them or holding them in place. So you both describe the process. Are there particular tools or approaches or things that you have found to be most useful in doing this kind of work?
I think for me, and I've learned this over time, is that representation matters. As an LGBT person, as a female presenting person, for the very conserving folks that I work with every day, they're not used to seeing female professional religious or religious authority folks. It's just not part of their world. So that's surprising to them. And the fact that I'm ordained and recognized as a religious leader is also surprising to them. So I wear what I affectionately call my drag outfit when I work out professionally, and I always wear purple, and that usually is a point of comment or conversation for folks. They'll come up to me and say, "Well, hello, Bishop," with a question mark at the end of that. And so it's a point for them to ask me questions, but it's also a way for me to be recognized. So if there's someone who thinks maybe they've seen me before, if they see me, they recognize that I'm wearing these clothes, because I'm always the only one looking like this. So that's a help. But also I don't know if you can see my pin. So
Yes.
that is actually the United Nations Sustainability Goals. And I wear this pin often because for folks who work in international work, they see that and they feel comfortable. For others who are LGBT or progressive, they see that and they see rainbow. And then in other locations, I take it off because in really conserving circles, the United Nations isn't necessarily popular. So I'm that intentional with what I look like in the world. So to me, it's kind of a marketing campaign in a way, being so thoughtful about what I look like and how I present myself every day.
So I teach pastoral care. And so I spent a lot of time, the last 27 years of my life, working with people about what it means to provide care in what we would consider to be fairly uh, understandable places in kind of the arenas of the church and the academy, or faith communities in the academy. And one of the things that I've really worked hard at and had to come to realize that the language of faith plays a really significant role in the public arena, in what David Tracy would call that third public, the society. So I've had to spend some time thinking about what's the role of religious language, religious both terms, but iconography, and the power of religion, religious language in public arenas, and to use the knowledge that I have to be very particular about how I use the religious framing in those spaces where generosity is going to be a good thing. I use language there when it needs to be a very strong point. I will be very, very intentional about how I use the language, but to be very intentional about using the language and not trying to be the biggest smarty pants in the room. That never plays well unless you're trying to shut somebody down. That doesn't work very well. But the generosity of the language and the framing that we have makes a ton of sense. And I can talk a little bit more about that, but that matters. That makes a big difference. I'm mindful we're coming up to this new election cycle, and every time we come into a new election cycle, religious language, religious framing jumps to the front, which is why I think it's really important for religious professionals to be clear about what the role of religious language and religious framing, because I think we bring something really important to the conversation.
Recently, I invited you to come to Salt Lake City and to be part of a gathering of national leaders, including a lot of senators and elected representatives, a lot of people who work on religious freedom concerns. I am curious what you noticed being in a different context, being with people that perhaps you wouldn't see every day. These are folks that I work with all the time, but I wonder what it was like for you, what you noticed about that.
That's a great question. So one of the things that I did notice is the use of religious language. I'll give a little bit of background in order to explain this. Theologians talk about the orders of religious language. The first order religious language is that very confessional language. It's the language we learn in our faith traditions that people in other faith traditions don't necessarily understand, but when we use it, it draws us into each other. It creates community. It can also be used to hold somebody away. And during political times, first order religious language out in the public arena is often used to hold someone away while they're also rallying the troops. Second order religious language is that much more interpretive language that people aren't staking claims, but trying to engage each other to make sure the language that they use and their understandings that is understood. So it's a slower, more intentional, more generous process. Third order is more of a religious language, is more of a meta language. So Marian, having said that, now one of the things that I noticed with your colleagues, because of their goal was to be open and find the bridges, to be generous. So the language that they were using was generous, was intentional, was not leaping to this sense that we all knew how we were using even if we were using the same language, there was that intentionality of making sure we knew when someone used the words, what they meant by the words. And because of that, it actually built these lovely relationships, even in some of those conversations which were really fun, to hear people talk that way, which was great. So that's one of the things that I noticed.
I think that's a wonderful point. And I think back to your original question, Steve, what are some tips and pointers for how to do this? I think, Kristen, you just named a very important one, which is defining terms. Because when we are in groups, we have a sense of what we mean by different things. So for example, if I were talking to my conserving colleagues, I would never refer to my clerics as my drag outfit. This is something that I use in certain contexts to build rapport, to show that, okay, I'm a trustworthy person in progressive circles. In conserving circles, I use very different language. So when having a conversation with someone who's different, or if it's a conversation that's very nuanced and very important, it is extremely important to lean into the skills we've learned in pastoral care class. How can we listen closely, and how can we respond in such a way to check that what we're hearing is correct? Restating in a way that isn't awkward, but just checking for understanding. How can we do that? And that would be an important tip to think about, is in congregations, in community settings, are folks sharing a common understanding of an important term, and maybe teasing that term apart. And it could be something as simple as faith. It could be something like family. Family, to me, being married to a woman with 2 trans kids out of 4 kids, is very different than my Mormon colleagues in plural communities where there are sister wives and there may be 20 children. So it's teasing apart these foundational terms that we're working with.
So as you work with your colleagues who come from more conserving traditions, and I know you understand that the location from which they're coming in many cases is very deeply held religious ideas that are not just cognitive. They're not just ideas, but they're in their bones. Because of that, though, I will assume that there are times when in those conversations, both intentionally and unintentionally, sometimes people will make comments, will ask questions that hit very sensitive spaces. And it's reasonable to think that one would be defensive. What do you do in that space?
That's a wonderful question. And it's something that I've learned over time, and painfully so. So now I prepare myself, and I suggest that others think this through and prepare themselves and do a couple things. So one thing is being aware, what are the topics that are comfortable for you to discuss, and what are the topics that are off limits. And if someone is going there, you're going to redirect, or you're going to go make a phone call or something. So being really self-aware of what works for you, and also having thought through very carefully, worked through what you believe, what you think, what you know, so that if this is a topic that you are willing to engage around, then B, there isn't anything that anyone can say to you that is going to put you back on your heels or be off-putting. It's a point of information for you to think about and respond to. So that being said, there are also times when people say things out of the blue. Even if you've prepared and it's a topic that you're set for, someone will say something that just plain hurts. So there's a couple things to look for here. One is to look for intent. Is someone looking to hurt you? And people do that. Unfortunately, we've all experienced that. So that's one thing. If someone is intending to hurt you, then my suggestion is you've thought through a response for that type of situation, and you say something that you're going to say that's respectful, or you absent yourself. The other thing is looking to see, has someone said that out of ignorance? And that's happened to all of us too. And then thinking through, okay, what's a response that is loving for yourself and loving for the other person, honoring both of you. And that may mean saying, let's talk about this another time. That doesn't mean you need to engage with it, even if it's a loving mistake. But it may mean that you do feel comfortable and you're able to say, I'm willing to talk about this. For others, that particular word choice would be deeply hurtful and it stings because, and explain it. Depending on the situation, these are things really to think through and maybe to try out and see how it works for you. And you'll find your style as you go.
I'm really struck by in this conversation, the sense of deep presence and listening, and also the sense of humility, of learning that what I might think I know is not the same as what is that person's world or that person's understanding. And also preparedness, so that, as you were just talking, Marian, that if there are potential points, flashpoints, or places where I'm entering into the conversation with some vulnerability, authentically so, and also aware that that could take a turn. So part of another hope for outcome of these conversations, and I think we're in that flow, is, are there other things, or would you revisit any of those things to encourage practice?
Teresa Luzo talked about the evangelist's gamble, which is that notion that if we are so committed to the faith that we have and what our faith does for us and strengthens us and emboldens us, that the evangelist's gamble is that as we go out into the world, we risk being changed, that our faith and the faith is strong enough to hold us as we navigate authentically, that the evangelist's gamble is the risk to be changed. And so I think part of these conversations is that we recognize we are risking and we are opening ourselves up to change. Now, clearly there's a limit to what we're not going to be so convicted in a way that is so contrary to what we think is healthy and safe and all of that. But there's parts of it that I think that evangelist gamble, if we can go in really with a sense of curiosity and a willingness to listen and perhaps be changed a bit, I think that's a pretty phenomenal moment. Now, it's more helpful when both people can be in that space at the same time. It's a little hard if you're in that space and someone's not. But I think there's a lot to learn from the evangelist's gamble.
I completely agree. And I also go back to pastoral care class and when I used to work as a chaplain in different places. It's so, to me, similar to chaplaincy, where we have encounters with folks and we're trained to have encounters with folks where we're not bringing our own personal views into the fore. Rather, we are listening carefully to someone else and helping them draw out what is deeply felt and also ideally healthy for the other folks. So I believe that clergy are uniquely suited to this type of work. And I also believe it is very like evangelism in a slightly different way. So if we think about the folks who are all about sharing the gospel, and how are the different ways you can share the gospel? You can be a street preacher and you can tell people, well, you're going to go to hell. That's one way of being an evangelist. And we can debate whether or not that's effective or not. There are people who share here are all the truth claims, and this is what backs it up. That's another way of being an evangelist. A third way is the kind that listens carefully to people's deep needs and their wants and their longings in the world. And how does that match up to the gospel of Christ? And I believe that as clergy, as followers of Christ, as people who are people of faith in the world, we are uniquely suited to be not only the bearers of good news, but also the hearers of good news from unexpected places.
What are some encouragements, some maybe, additional advice, things you would say to people who are, again, entering into this season, political season, where so much money and time and energy is spent on having people feel very separate from one another and feel, outraged by the other and righteous, and all of the kinds of things that go with this time, and others, that what are some things, encouragements that you would have for people who want not to just live in that way, but feel a sense that their integrity and faith calls them to be in relationship with others and connect with others who aren't in the same frame that they are?
Letty Russell talks about creating community and gathering around a third thing, which is there are times where we're just not going to agree on some things, but if we really want to try to work across those boundaries, find something that you can be in a space together with, work on a project with someone who you might differ with. So find something. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to have to give up their opinions on things, and nor will you, but find a third thing that allows you to have something that comes together and relates in a way that creates an additional bond that you may not have resolved those other spaces, but you've created something new. I think that's always good can come out of that. If for no other reason, when we kind of fall back to those other places of seizure, we recognize we will be different in those spaces.
I love that. I love that so much. And Kristen, I completely agree. And I think as pastors, as leaders in communities, as you all are, you are in a unique position of being able to coordinate different types of people to come together and work on something. I have a pastor friend in Little Rock, Arkansas, really conserving guy, and he intentionally invites all different folks from around the community to work together on a food bank. And he loves putting different people together, and they become friends. And then they suddenly realize that, oh, we don't share the same politics or opinions about a lot of things, but I like you and you like me, and people are surprised. So that's always my top tip, is make a friend who's very different from you. So when you read something, see something on the news, and you think, how can that be? How can those people think that way? Instead of those people, I think of my friend Derek, and I call him up and I say, I don't understand school vouchers at all. Can you explain that to me? I know you're in favor of them. And Derek will explain it. And then I realize, oh, okay, well, maybe I'm not in favor of that, but now I understand it. Think through, do I have these folks? Is there someone I can think of who is this political ideology, who has this faith background, who is this, that, and the other? And if not, ask your friends, hey, do you know anyone? Can you introduce me to anyone? Look for someone in your community that you admire who's different, and reach out to them. Drop them an email and say, wow, I really admire your work. Thank you for what you do. And it's surprising the friendships that you can make that way. Just being a little bit outgoing can go a long way.
Well, I can't express how deeply blessed I feel to be in the presence of this conversation, and each of your wisdom and the thoughtful work that you did in having a conversation before this conversation. It's our intention to add to the resources as we go along, as we grow this community. And so I hope that each of you will know how grateful I am. And then because, you know, pastors ask for more all the time. I hope each of you will be willing to be part of this ongoing conversation in this community as it grows.